America without free speech is like a phone without a charger. They're doing just fine with election interference. We have seen the polls that said if Americans knew about the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, the election outcome would have been different, and y'all wanted that silenced so greatly. But who decides what is true or false? I certainly don't trust the federal government to make that distinction.
We have an entire political party which is organizing itself around this radical moral agnosticism, claiming that there's no way we can know the difference between whether an election is on Tuesday or whether an election is on Thursday, as Vladimir Putin wants to tell us through his sinister propaganda put out by the Internet Research Agency.
The CCP is already infiltrating our culture, our farmland, our skies, but the DC City Council will let them infiltrate our ballot boxes. There have been 65 carjackings in Washington, D.C. just this year alone. That is more than one every single day.
He joins the chorus denouncing crime in Washington, D.C., which is suddenly of concern to them. I had not heard them mention that before. Well, it turns out that Bakersfield, California, has one of the highest crime rates in America, recently described as one of the top 10 deadliest cities in America for its size, and its crime rate is higher than that of Washington, D.C. And yet, we're going to take this opportunity to kick around the people of Washington, D.C. Why? Because they're vulnerable, because they don't have voting representation in the House, and they have no voting representation or voice in the U.S. Senate. That's a scandal from the standpoint of democracy.
President Trump was in office when the COVID virus was released from a lab in China, from the Wuhan lab. And he tried to make that very clear that this came from China. And reporters regularly dismissed that. They called him a xenophobe because he was just saying where the virus came from. He did not mandate masks. Your president did.
I appreciate the gentlelady's passion. There are two facts that she should perhaps be alerted to. One is that Donald Trump, on more than 20 different occasions, defended the performance of the Chinese government, and specifically President Xi, in terms of his treatment of COVID-19, and said he was doing a wonderful job and a great job, and they were working closely and they were constantly in touch.
President Xi is working very hard. As you know, I spoke with him recently. He's working really hard. Yes, I think he's doing it very professionally. We're also working with him and helping him as of the last few days, as you know.
I spoke with President Xi. We had a great talk. He's working very hard, I have to say. He's working very, very hard.
So if there's a problem with the Chinese government unleashing a virus which has not been proven anywhere, but it certainly could be true, you would have to pin that on your favorite president, Donald Trump, not on Joe Biden.
The GOP has now debuted their big plan for dealing with inflation in America with H.R. 347, something called the Rein-In Act, a reporting requirement related to a handful of executive orders every year, is the GOP's response to inflation after barnstorming the entire country, claiming that they had some kind of solution. Now, you might think it's the most brilliant thing since the invention of Social Security, which they opposed, or Medicare, which they opposed, or you might think it's the dumbest thing since Donald Trump's last $1 trillion corporate tax giveaway. But either way, it will have zero effect on inflation or deflation in the United States of America.
Americans are paying more for everything because of left-wing extremist policies. Instead of addressing these major economic concerns head-on, the Democrat solution to inflation is to keep on spending.
I just wanted to educate our distinguished colleagues that Democrat is the noun. When you use it as an adjective, you say the Democratic member, or the Democratic solution, or the Democratic plan. And so I assume it's a good faith grammatical error the first few times. But after people are corrected several times and they continue to say it, it seems like it's an act of incivility, as if every time we mentioned the other party, it just came out with a kind of political speech impediment like, oh, the banana Republican Party. as if we were to say that every time we mentioned the Banana Republican member or the Banana Republican plan or the Banana Republican Conference. But we wouldn't do that.
Look, I'm not from Maryland. I don't live around the Beltway here where everything's just fine. I live up in Pennsylvania where $1 billion or $1 million is a lot of money to hardworking people that get up in the dark at night and head out to work.
I did hear my colleague from Pennsylvania make some sort of disparaging remark about Maryland and about how he didn't live in Maryland, where apparently we don't understand the value of money. Well, the land where we actually are standing today used to be part of Maryland. It was ceded by Maryland to Congress for the purposes of creating the District of Columbia. And when our capital came under attack by violent insurrectionists and those who were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and who were determined to overthrow the 2020 presidential election, there were hundreds of police officers who came from Maryland to join the Metropolitan Police Department and the Capitol officers in defense of the capital of the United States. So I take umbrage at any insinuation that the people of Maryland need to take a backseat to anybody in terms of the defense of the principles of this country. So I would thank Mr. Perry for a correction about that.
Our colleagues embrace what's called the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment. Our colleague, Mr. Gates, says the Second Amendment is, quote,
about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government if that becomes necessary.
Our colleague Chip Roy says the Second Amendment was designed purposefully to empower the people
to be able to resist the force of tyranny used against them to step over their natural rights given to them by God.
Congresswoman Boebert says the Second Amendment, quote,
it has nothing to do with hunting, unless you're talking about hunting tyrants, maybe.
Well, this theory is completely debunked and destroyed by the text of the Constitution itself and by Supreme Court precedent. And yet their theory of the Second Amendment is killing Americans.
Like many Democrat-run crime-ridden cities, Washington is now notoriously unsafe. Local leaders have utterly failed in their duty to protect residents and visitors, as well as to provide MPD officers with the resources and political backing, and I emphasize that, needed to effectively defend D.C. from rising crime.
The passionate statement of the gentleman from Georgia, I wish I had seen equal passion on behalf of public safety in the District of Columbia on January 6th, when 150 of our officers were violently assaulted by a mob that he came to describe as engaging in a normal tourist visit.
Watching the TV footage of those who entered the Capitol and walked through Statuary Hall showed people in an orderly fashion staying between the stanchions and ropes taking videos and pictures. You know, if you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
No leader was more outspoken or more forceful than you were, Ms. Weingarten, in not only demanding, but developing specific strategies to safely reopen America's schools. My question for you is, why are you, of all people, being scapegoated today by the Republicans for doing the exact opposite of what you were actually doing during all of that time? How did you get my friends mad?
I advocated for the safety of our children and for their education. But you, as a political activist, for the president of the teachers union, were not advocating for anything good for our kids. And our kids have suffered greatly.
When I heard that
No, we know what you did. You endorsed him and did a six-figure ad buy. Your organization did 18 days later.
No, listen,
I'm talking. I'm not, I run a committee too.
Maybe it's because we tried to do something that nobody else was trying to do. Our members were terrified, others were terrified. And what we were simply looking for was clear scientific guidance. And when we couldn't get it, we did it ourselves, and we worked with doctors and we worked with others, and we just tried to get it out there.
As we all know around here, when you go woke, you go broke. Today's hearing will help us better understand what Congress can do to ensure that activist stakeholders will not encourage woke corporate activism, as we have seen recently with Anheuser-Busch, Disney, and even Nike.
Although every other word coming out of their mouths these days is woke, our friends have proven famously unable to define what they mean by woke. So I did a little research, and I want to help with the etymology of the word. Woke comes from the Indo-European root weg, which means to be strong, lively, alert. That root grew into woke, awake, wakefulness, but it also grew into the closely related word vigilance. The opposite of a vigilant, woke investment strategy is a negligent and inattentive investment strategy. Or to put it more simply, when it comes to climate change, if you don't have a woke capitalism, you're going to have a broke capitalism.
This is clearly an attempt to diminish our Second Amendment rights. Instead of trying to erode our Second Amendment rights, I would offer, let's protect our kids. I refuse to allow the erosion of our Second Amendment rights to further disarm our population, making us less safe as a further push toward communism, because that's what happens.
They say, we want to repeal the Second Amendment. Mr. Speaker, we don't want them to repeal the Second Amendment. We want them to read the Second Amendment. Because the Second Amendment would ask us why we are allowing people to go into elementary schools, Walmarts, supermarkets, churches and synagogues all over America with AR-15s enabled sometimes with the stabilizing brace, as in Dayton, Ohio, Boulder, Colorado, Colorado Springs, Nashville, Tennessee, and assassinate our people.
Mr. Schiff exploited his position as chair of Intel Committee and every opportunity possible, threatening national security, undermining our duly elected president, and bringing dishonor upon the institution. This is not a partisan act. This is not a conservative versus liberal vote. This is a clear vote between right and wrong, and I urge you to do the right thing. If we run away from this opportunity to hold this man accountable, there is only one fault, and that is of ourselves. We will betray the people who trusted us and sent us here to do the right thing.
We're seeing the complete ethical collapse of a once great political party. The Republican Party began as a pro-freedom, anti-racist, pro-immigrant, anti-know-nothing party. It has become an authoritarian cult of personality, taking orders from an inciter of insurrection, a bully and braggart whose rage towards Mike Pence and whose spectacular disrespect for the rule of law endangered not only our entire constitutional order, but everyone in this room. The party of Lincoln and his Lincolnites has become the party of Luna and her Luna followers.
I was watching President Trump's town hall meeting on CNN last week, and I saw two remarkable things that clarified in my mind what's happening here.
Millions of votes, and all you have to do is take a look at government cameras. You'll see them. People going to 28 different voting booths to vote, to put in 7 ballots apiece. I never met this woman. Could kill the baby in the 9th month or after the baby was born. Did finish the wall. We don't have ammunition for ourselves right now. We don't have ammunition for ourselves. We're giving away so much. If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours. Get boxes sent to Chinatown, where they don't speak even English in that Chinatown we're talking about.
First, I saw Donald Trump blame Vice President Pence for failing to steal the election for him on January 6th. As Trump emphasized on January 6th, he believed, and he continues to believe, that Pence did not have, quote, the courage to do what needed to be done. Moreover, Trump assured his cult followers that Pence was never in any danger from the invading mob chanting "Hang Mike Pence," and all the violence was Pence's own fault for not succumbing to Trump and becoming the first vice president in our history to step outside of his constitutional role and declare the president the winner against the actual Electoral College vote. But we also saw Trump castigate and blame Jean Carroll, the woman he sexually abused in a department store and later lied about and defamed. Trump called her a whack job and asked what kind of woman meets somebody and brings them up, and within minutes you're playing hanky-panky in a dressing room. You see, he thinks it's her fault that he sexually abused her. And watching these two glaring cases of the GOP frontrunner for the presidential nomination in 2024 blaming the victim for his crime made me see what's happening with these hearings on Washington. They're part of an effort to deny Americans who live in Washington the right to participate in representative government, and then to blame them for their own disenfranchisement and their own lack of representation in Congress.
February 28th, I wrote the Attorney General asking him why there's no special counsel in the Hunter Biden investigation. He didn't respond, which is unusual in and of itself. They always respond to the Judiciary Committee when we write something to them. Who are you going to believe? The Justice Department can't get their story straight, changed 3 times in 33 days, or these two guys? I think I'll believe these guys. I think they're the ones telling the truth. And that is fundamentally what this comes down to.
Today, we get to witness MAGA Republicans take the side of IRS agents from the deep state against a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney and a rich guy exercising his Second Amendment rights, but now facing criminal gun charges and tax charges that they would call in any other circumstance purely technical. If my GOP colleagues think that the treatment of millions of tax scofflaws, or even the handful who face criminal prosecution like Hunter Biden, is too lenient, I invite them to join us Democrats in supporting the $80 billion in funding for the IRS that we passed in the Inflation Reduction Act last year. This money will enable the IRS to make long overdue improvements in customer service, but will also enable the agency to restore lost capabilities and enforcement to identify and prosecute tax cheats. But the very first thing House Republicans did this Congress was vote to rescind that funding while disparaging these future IRS employees who will do the same kind of work today's witnesses do.
The same nation that defended Nazism in World War II must now defeat an internal rot promoting the same senseless violence and hatred of Jewish people. It is a sad fact, but this type of anti-Semitic hate is being promoted by a small group of members in this body, chiefly Representative Tlaib. We must hold her accountable.
And what about the members who defended conspiracy theorist Alex Jones and stated that Sandy Hook and Parkland mass murders of dozens of school children were staged by Hollywood to generate support for gun safety? That's not even a matter of opinion, but adjudicated positive fact, and still, the Constitution protects your right to be wrong about facts unless you're deliberately defrauding or cheating someone out of something like money or campaign contributions. What of all of those members who have followed the former president in advancing the big lie that he actually won the 2020 election? Should we convert the 60 federal and state court decisions rejecting claims of election fraud and corruption into discipline and punishment of members who still cling to that view? Look at what the Republicans are saying about the Republicans today on Capitol Hill as we live through all of the reverberations of the Chaos Caucus. So, the world is burning around us. We're fiddling. We don't have a strategy. That's Representative Steve Womack, Republican from Louisiana. We're fractured, says a member of this committee, Representative Anna Luna from Florida. It's not a normal majority, says Representative Tom Cole, Republican of Oklahoma. Here's Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about the Republicans. This conference is absolutely broken. Here's Kevin McCarthy, who used to be Speaker before he was deposed by the Republicans. This is embarrassing for the Republican Party. It's embarrassing for the nation. Here's Representative David Joyce from Ohio, who probably sums it up best. We're a party that can't govern. Here's Representative Troy Niels from Texas. We're a broken conference. Representative Tom Emmer said if it were a family, quote, we'd be the most dysfunctional family on the face of the planet. Here's Representative Austin Scott, who ran briefly for Speaker in the speakership sweepstakes taking place right now. It makes us look like a bunch of idiots. And Representative Mark Alford from Michigan, another Republican, we are a ship that doesn't have a rudder right now. So it would be great if we could actually get a Speaker of the House and a functioning House of Representatives so we could deal with these issues. All right, so let's get it straight. We're 62 hours away from shutting down the government of the United States of America, and Republicans are launching an impeachment drive based on a long debunked and discredited lie. This isn't partisan warfare America's seeing today. It is chaotic infighting between Republicans and Republicans. It's MAGA versus extreme MAGA, as if anybody in the real world could tell the difference between the two. What a staggering failure of leadership. Speaker McCarthy's invertebrate appeasement of the most fanatical elements of his conference now threatens the well-being of every American. Now, some people think the members of the GOP caucus aren't interested in anything logical. They just want to see the world burn, as Alfred Pennyworth put it in The Dark Knight. But I see a method in the madness. A week ago, Donald Trump posted a comment saying that a government shutdown, quote, is the last chance to defund these political prosecutions against me and other patriots. You get it? To delay justice, Donald Trump would cut off paychecks to a couple million service members and federal workers and furlough more than 1 million workers and pay them
later for having not worked. They would halt food assistance to millions of moms and kids and keep NIH in my district from enrolling any more patients in life and death clinical research trials.
Our investigation has revealed how Joe Biden knew of, participated in, and benefited from his family cashing in on the Biden name around the world. The White House is seeking to block key testimony from current and former White House staff. It's also withholding thousands of records from Joe Biden's time as vice president.
Gentleman's time has
President
expired.
Biden must be held accountable for his lies, corruption, and obstruction.
You know, the reason mysteries are called whodunits is because they start with a crime and then you have to try to figure out who did it. The Biden impeachment investigation isn't a whodunit, it's a what is it? It's like an Agatha Christie novel where the mystery is what's the crime? And that gets very tedious very fast. Now, it's true Chairman Comer has collected a mountain of evidence over the last 11 months, tens of thousands of pages of documents, dozens of hours of interviews with government officials, but all of it clearly shows that Joe Biden committed no crime. Even their own witnesses that they called to the only public hearing they had said there is not remotely enough evidence to justify impeachment. Chairman Comer has bragged on Fox News about procuring 100% compliance with his subpoenas. So forget about obstruction, which I hear them muttering about today.
There is a reason that last week's hearing, the university presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT made history as the most watched congressional testimony in history with over 1 billion views. It was pathetic, amoral, and inhumane, and by God, the world heard it. And as I said in the hearing, it does not depend on the context. As attacks against Jewish students have skyrocketed on campuses across America, we clearly have tremendous work ahead of us, Mr. Speaker, to address this rot of anti-Semitism that is now rooted in our once premier higher education institutions. And we will not be deterred by this important work.
Now, I hold no brief for the college president's overly legalistic, ethically tone-deaf answers awkwardly advanced in response to Ms. Stefanik's rapid-fire yes-no questions. It should not be difficult for anybody to say that in the age of rampant gun violence and lax Republican gun laws, which have put tens of millions of AR-15s into circulation in our society, anyone calling for genocide of the Jews or anyone else should be sent immediately a campus security detail to see if they pose the risk of harm to other people or if they need an immediate mental health exam. And if there's not an imminent threat, surely the call for genocide of the Jews by definition constitutes a hostile learning environment and should occasion aggressive disciplinary action. So where was the common sense on the part of the college presidents? But where is the common sense in the Congress of the United States of America? Calling for the resignation of private individuals at private universities would be a dramatic and unprecedented departure for the U.S. Congress, which has never before voted to tell a college president to resign. Before we affix this lifelong stigma, reproach, and dishonor on a private citizen, do you think perhaps we should offer them some kind of due process? The kind of due process that even George Santos got and that Donald Trump is getting all over America right now for his 91 federal and state felony charges?
I would like to zoom out on this one problem. Biden's national drug control strategy is 150 pages. The words God and faith are not mentioned one time. People need a purpose to be happy. To quote Robert F. Kennedy, I know that's awful hard, quote, unemployment kills, end of quote.
The gentleman is somehow looking for some kind of religious test, which is explicitly forbidden in the Constitution to people for public office in the drug control strategy. What about the free exercise clause? What about the establishment clause of the Constitution, which says that the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion?
But public classrooms should not be a place for advancing personal agendas or political propaganda. The role of our public educators is to educate, not to indoctrinate.
We have seen a push towards centralizing education by the government, a mentality seen too often with the left taking away those decisions from parents. This bill puts parents in control, and everyone who cares about the welfare of our youngest citizens should support this bill.
It's amazing to me to see politicians who oppose a universal violent criminal background check and who defend assault weapons after the massacres at Columbine, after Parkland, Florida, after Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut, after Uvalde, after Santa Fe, Texas, that they are now going to keep America's children safe by banning The Handmaid's Tale in 1984. We can do better for the children of America.
Whether it was bats or leaks or bureaucrats who caused it, Donald Trump was the biggest apologist in the United States of America for President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. No finding will ever exonerate or rehabilitate Donald Trump for his lethal recklessness in mismanaging the crisis in America, which cost us more than 1 million lives. Most people will recognize as absurd all the whining by election deniers, COVID deniers, white supremacists, and neo-Nazis that they somehow have a God-given right to spout off on other people's private internet platforms. Give me a break. If you don't like rules against public health disinformation or racist incitement, then go set up your own social media platform. Most of us don't want to live in a world where our government withholds critical factual information from social media entities and then right-wing politicians heckle and harass them to force them to host election deniers, Holocaust deniers, COVID-19 deniers, racist anti-Semites, and so on. Compelling social media to carry the propaganda of big liars cannot be the meaning of free speech in the 21st century.
The Show Up Act offers a much-needed solution to this problem of federal agencies and federal employees putting their own comfort before our constituents' needs. One would have thought that, as the pandemic wound down, federal workers would have returned to their offices just as private sector workers across the nation did.
This bill would take a sledgehammer to federal telework policy and law, which the sponsors seem completely oblivious to, and you can hardly blame them because the leadership brings this measure forward without the benefit of even a single hearing in the Oversight Committee.
The IRS has failed to get Americans the refunds in a timely manner for 3 years running, and as late as last year, still had 12.4 million returns to process.
And it's rich people who are the ones who are being protected by the refusal of my colleagues to invest in the IRS. Telework is a complete distraction. It is an absolute red herring. It's got nothing to do with whether or not you want to invest in the IRS or not.
The FBI has a Facebook page. CDC has a Twitter account. They regularly get ratioed for the ridiculousness they put on social media. Anything that goes against the government narrative on vaccines, on treatments for COVID, on the election, anything that goes against what the government wants you to hear is disinformation.
This is an exercise in sycophancy more than it is in really trying to figure out the law. I wish just one of my colleagues would say Donald Trump really should not have gotten the White House to try to take down the private tweets put up that he didn't like. I've not heard one say that, and yet that's the only example that we got during our February 8th hearing of a government official actually using the government to try to coerce Twitter to take down something that he didn't like.
We are working to cut wasteful spending, get to the bottom of fraudulent payments made by the federal government, support American energy production, and oppose tax increases proposed by the Democrats. Economic strength and job growth result from policies that unshackle job creators, allow American ingenuity, and provide certainty.
I want to just clear up a couple things. First, I heard the very distinguished gentlelady from Colorado mention job creators. I assume she was responding to President Biden, since 12 million new jobs have been created under President Biden, whereas millions of jobs were lost under the prior president, who may be a favorite of the gentleladies. I also wanted to make just a brief semantic point, because the gentlelady was making a grammatical error that I heard some of her colleagues make before. I believe she referred to a Democrat solution. I heard another member talk about a Democrat member and a Democrat plan. I just wanted to educate our distinguished colleagues that Democrat is the noun. When you use it as an adjective, you say the Democratic member. Out of pure political courtesy, when it's an adjective, refer to the Democratic congresswoman or the Democratic member. Having said that, I'd like to say that I favor the Boebert amendment. I think it's really the Raskin amendment because none of them apparently caught the fact that their reporting requirement wasn't to be published until I told them. I actually read the bill and I said, you know, there's no publication of it. So this amendment follows through on the fact that I pointed out to them that their bill didn't even call for publication of the inflation information which they thought was so essential. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to support the Boebert amendment because I think I'm the genesis of it. And with that, I'm happy to yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do just want to take a few seconds to respond. That was great. You know, we are addressed as MAGA extremists, extreme MAGA Republicans, and I would like to make just a clarification point. It's ultra MAGA. That's what we prefer.
The people in Washington, D.C. want to make their decisions about democratic self-government for themselves. They don't want the representatives of other Americans to come and make decisions for them. My friends across the aisle want to spend this week instead superintending and reviewing the bills that are being passed by the D.C. City Council for 713,000 American citizens who live in Washington, D.C. Yesterday it was about voting rights, and today it's about criminal justice reform, and I'm sure down the road, just as in the past, it's going to be their gun safety laws, and it's going to be their laws allowing for Medicaid-funded abortions for poor women, and then they'll go after their LGBTQ laws, and so on. There will be a parade of attacks on local democratic self-government in Washington, D.C. The distinguished gentleman from Georgia invoked a couple of crimes in Washington, D.C., including one in the metro. He didn't talk about the hundreds of crimes that were committed here at the Capitol, in Congress, in Washington, D.C., because he viewed the events of January 6th as akin to a, quote, normal tourist visit. And now he dares to lecture the people of Washington, D.C. about keeping Washington, D.C. safe. He seeks to associate Washington, D.C. with crime. And indeed, he and his colleagues constantly try to link images of crime to what they call Democrat-controlled cities. So I did some research last night just to clarify matters. The 7 states with the highest murder rates in 2020 all were states that were majority for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. The murder rate in the states that voted for Trump was higher in aggregate than the murder rate in the states that voted for Biden in each year from 2000 to 2020. So I would invite the gentleman not to lecture the people of Washington, D.C. about crime rates, because the murder rate is worse in the red states than it is in the blue states. 5 of the 10 cities with the highest murder rate through the first half of last year were in states that voted for Donald Trump in 2020. All those cities have higher murder rates than Washington, D.C. Among the top 10 is a city in the state represented by the sponsor of the disapproval resolution, Mr. Clyde. Now, the speaker rose to talk about both yesterday's resolution and today's resolution. He also gave the people of Washington, D.C. a lecture about diluting the vote when he rejects their admission to the Union as a state. In other words, he's trying to squelch and nullify their statehood drive that would give them real political equality in the country, and then he says the people of Washington, D.C. are diluting the vote. Well, he's blockading the vote. He's preventing the vote for people in Washington, D.C. You know, on January 6th, when we were attacked at the Capitol and in this chamber, there were hundreds of residents of Washington, D.C. who worked for the Capitol Police, who worked for the Metropolitan Police Department, who worked for other police forces, who came here to defend us. They came to defend the Congress that they are excluded from. You talk about patriotism, that's patriotism. And these people have a real grievance, a valid grievance, not an imaginary, fake, counterfeit grievance like a presidential election, which they still claim Donald Trump won. even though their arguments were rejected in more than 60 federal and state courts. And Trump lost that election by more than 7 million votes, 306 and 232 in the Electoral College. I'm glad you're nodding over on that side of the aisle, because these facts are indisputable. And yet still, they indulge the follies and the fantasies and the pathologies of Donald Trump. That's what they do instead. And they try to kick around the people of Washington, D.C., who defended us as patriots on that day. And there are veterans in Washington, D.C., and we'll submit these for the record, who have demanded their voting rights and demanded admission as a state. And yet they dare to lecture the people of Washington, D.C. about what to do with their democratic rights. I reserve.
You know, there's something a bit presumptuous about legislation called the Protecting Speech from Government Interference Act, because that, of course, is the whole purpose and meaning of the First Amendment, which protects all private speech against government interference, censorship, and punishment. If our prideful ambition today is to improve upon the framers' handiwork crafting the First Amendment, we must be very careful to address actual real problems without creating numerous new problems and threats to free speech, democracy, and public safety along the way. Legislation should address real problems. The original flaw of this legislation is that it's based on the entirely false premise that government officials pressured or coerced Twitter to suppress the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop for all of 24 hours. At our last hearing, none of the 3 witnesses called by the GOP majority supported that theory in any way. In fact, the hearing ended with the conclusion on February 8th that there was no governmental pressure or coercion involved in the private company's fleeting independent decision to moderate access to the Hunter Biden laptop story for a day or two. Yet after having failed to identify any government action in this sequence of events, the legislation conveniently moves to redefine censorship from meaning government suppression of private speech to meaning private entities regulating their own speech content and speech platforms. This move is radical indeed. We usually do not say that newspapers and TV networks censor themselves when they decide to put one thing on the air instead of another. Indeed, even with the recent shocking disclosure of internal conversations showing that Fox News anchors like Tucker Carlson completely knew that Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and Donald Trump were lying about their ridiculous 2020 election claims and called them behind the scenes insane, absurd, shockingly reckless, and dangerous hell, but then credited those claims on air, nonetheless, it would still be strange to say that Fox News was censoring itself. Yet the whole purpose and design of the legislation is to protect private speakers from being censored by private media entities because of prior communications they may have had with the government or information they may have received from the government. But the receipt or collection of information from the government does not transform a private entity's editorial decisions into state action from the standpoint of the First Amendment. For example, if a newspaper is set to run an op-ed saying that the COVID vaccine is more dangerous to the public than COVID, for example, but then the CDC sends out a report completely debunking that claim, and so the editors decide not to run the op-ed, that's a private editorial decision entirely protected by the First Amendment. The disappointed op-ed writer has no First Amendment cause of action against the CDC or against the newspaper. Social media companies have a First Amendment right to establish their own rules governing their own speech, including false speech and speech inciting violence and race hate. Social media companies also have a right to use threat information shared by the government to enforce their rules and make private business decisions. But H.R. 140 now threatens the ability of law enforcement and other government agencies to share information that these companies want to get, such as information warning them of violence inciting and violence planning speech on their platforms that poses a serious threat to public safety and democratic institutions. H.R. 140 would work as a Putin Protection Act, Given his demonstrated propensity for spending tens of millions of dollars on his internet research agency to pump propaganda and fake news directly into the bloodstream of American political campaigns. This is a serious danger created by this legislation, given the escalating global campaign by autocrats, theocrats, and communist bureaucrats to inject chaos and division in democratic societies. This bill seeks to solve what we already established in our hearings was not a problem at all, but because of its selective nature, it would create numerous serious problems going forward for American democracy while still allowing politicians to threaten private media entities over their content and editorial decisions. And we will have more to say about how much of that is really going on. I respectfully urge the committee to reject H.R. 140, and I yield back.
You know, after 2 years of rooting for economic failure and blaming President Biden for everything, for post-COVID global inflation, for the instability caused by supply chain breakdowns and the phenomenal failure of Donald Trump's mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic, after all that, after all the whining and crying about inflation, Republicans finally have the chance to take center stage right now with their proposed solution to the problem of inflation. And the world's been waiting with bated breath. Would it be what Richard Nixon did? Wage and price controls? Would it be what Herbert Hoover, that Republican, did? Total laissez-faire? Whatever happens, happens. Well, the long wait is over. The GOP has now debuted their big plan for dealing with inflation in America with H.R. 347, something called the Rein-In Act, which stands for the Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act. It's a bill for a mandatory reporting requirement related to executive orders that might apply to 2 or 3 executive orders a year. You got that right. It will have zero effect on inflation or deflation in the United States of America. Nothing. It's not going to have any effect at all. Now, I know our friends in the GOP are interested in this session of Congress in tortured, inscrutable, incomprehensible acronyms, and so they can have the Rein-In Act, which they seem very connected to, but I want to suggest a better title that will still conform to their acronym. Let's call it the Running on Empty Initiative based on No Ideas None Act. How about that? The legislation was hatched without any hearing, and it shows it has no legislative meaning and no potential economic consequences. Even as reporting bills go, it's pathetically weak, as it doesn't even require publication of the report. They came up with a reporting requirement that didn't even require the report to be published. Look, executive orders are not the cause of inflation, and there is no economic research suggesting they are. The most conservative economists in the world will tell you that inflation is a complex global phenomenon connected to prices, supply chains, supply and demand curves, and unemployment rate. So, Democratic policies have allowed the U.S. to absorb the shock of rising inflation engulfing the globe since 2020. That's serious economic policy, what President Biden and the Democrats are engaged in, and they have a silly little symbolic messaging bill for a couple of notations they didn't even want to publish originally within the process of offering executive orders. We created 12 million new jobs in America. How many million jobs do they want to erase over there in their desperate, sudden pursuit of inflation? You know, they raised the debt limit 3 times under Donald Trump. Now they talk about the debt limit all the time. They raised it 3 times, and they contributed under Donald Trump 25% of all the debt in the United States from George Washington to Joe Biden. 25% of the debt under one president, Donald Trump. And they did that. And now they dare come talk to us about inflation. And the bill that they advance is one to have some people pass some more paperwork around. Come on, give me a break. Give us something better than the running on empty initiative with no new ideas at all. We recommend a no vote what real economic action requires is precisely what President Biden is already doing.
You can call any bill here anything you want to. You can call it the, kittens are beautiful and the sun's going to shine today. But here's what I know. In central Pennsylvania, where I live, the good citizens that I represent are paying $5, $6, $7 for a dozen eggs. They're paying $6, $7 for a pound of hamburger. They can't afford to drive to work, and they can't afford to pay their energy bills, and they're having a hard time paying their mortgage. That's inflation, sir.
Yes, the prices of housing are too high. The prices of groceries are too high. That's why the administration is working concretely to lower prices and why inflation is coming down now across the board. And so what do we get from the majority today? They want a reporting bill about the inflationary impact in executive orders. Nothing even about what Congress is doing and how Congress is behaving and contributing to inflation. They want to somehow add a technical reporting requirement for executive orders and think that that's accomplishing something. Well, the administration is lowering the costs of student debt, despite the fact that they're doing everything they can to stop it. The administration is acting to lower housing prices across the country, and we have moved to lower prescription drug prices and health care across the country, and they've been fighting us every step along the way. And instead, they come back with this reporting bill, which will do nothing to help the fight against inflation.
This amendment requires for executive orders that are found to have an impact on the consumer price index, we got to have some measure, right? And most people recognize the consumer price index, which is a detailed description of that impact.
I'm afraid I remain unilluminated as to what that amendment will do. Apparently, the purpose is to require a more detailed or technical description of the projected impact when an assessment required by the bill finds that there will be some inflationary effect. Again, this sounds like it's simply adding more bureaucracy, more paperwork with no return on investment for the taxpayer dollars that it would obviously take to conduct such an analysis. I mean, here we've gone for more than 2 centuries with apparently no economist arguing that what we really need to stop inflation is more reporting in the process of issuance of executive orders by presidents of the United States. And suddenly, somebody had a great epiphany over there without even a legislative hearing that what was really needed was just for the President of the United States to append an inflationary statement to executive orders at the rate of $1 billion, perhaps to be amended to $1 million, or who knows, it's 50 million or 100 million, but it doesn't make any difference because there's no data behind any of it. Basically, they're scraping the bottom to try to figure out something to say about inflation because the administration is actually bringing inflation down. Now, we notice they don't talk about unemployment, which used to be their mantra, jobs, jobs, jobs. But when Joe Biden came back and created 12 million new jobs after the last administration destroyed millions of jobs with their lethal recklessness in the mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic, and Joe Biden turned it around in this administration, they stopped talking about it. But they did notice that there was global inflation going on because of the disruption of the global supply chain and because of Vladimir Putin's filthy imperialist invasion of Ukraine, which some of their members actually are cheerleaders for. There was a real problem with inflation, and the administration has steadily been bringing it down, which is why it doesn't have quite the political salience it used to. But the world was waiting with bated breath to determine what would their actual plan be. And alas, their whole plan is a reporting requirement, nothing to do with Congress and Congress being able to do anything, but a reporting requirement for the president when he issues executive orders. I think the public is gravely disappointed by this complete collapse of any real commitment to the one issue they thought they had organized their conference around. I reserve.
The gentleman from Maryland, my friend from Maryland, talks about increased bureaucracy, the increased bureaucracy of informing the American people. My goodness, I've never heard that from my friends on the other side of the aisle, increased bureaucracy. I mean, all they do around here is infuse more government into our lives with every single thing they do. Talks about the medical situation and price fixing. He doesn't call it price fixing, but that's what it is. He's saying it's been unnecessary to do this. My goodness, my good friend from Maryland is a member of the legislature. You think he'd want to preserve the power of the legislature instead of handing it to the executive branch, which is what this place has done for years upon years. Now we have a chance, and my friend wants to hand yet more power to the executive branch instead of preserving the power of his branch that he serves in.
One can only regard with amazement the gentleman's insinuation that I want to hand power to the executive branch when we have been acting here in Congress to pass the Infrastructure Act, to pass the Inflation Reduction Act in the last Congress. All of the measures they opposed, we moved in order to make real economic progress in the country. Congress was doing that. They've got the big opportunity today to come forward with what their anti-inflation agenda is, and their whole anti-inflation agenda is we're going to beg the President of the United States to append some inflation numbers to an executive order, to a handful of executive orders over the course of the year. The gentleman also, I think, slipped in his opposition to our legislation, which reduces to $35 a month what diabetics have to pay for their insulin shots. He calls this price fixing. My friend from Pennsylvania is invited to contradict me if I misunderstood him. I think he was describing all of the lowering of prescription drug prices we've done. We're saving Americans across the country, millions of Americans, thousands of dollars in their Medicare prescription drug prices, and the gentleman just called that price fixing. I assume he's opposed to it. I'd be happy to yield if you want to correct me, but otherwise I'm going to go back with the conclusion that you're opposed to all of the lowering of prescription drug prices that the Congress actually engaged in the 117th Congress. And finally, the gentleman would like to somehow put in our court the burden of bureaucracy. Well, let's talk about the major bureaucracy that's being put in place in America today to violate the rights and the freedom of women to make their own medical decisions as they try to criminalize that. And most of them, I don't know exactly where the gentleman is, perhaps he can clarify it, most of them support a national ban on abortion, taking what was a constitutional right for more than a half century and turning it into a felony criminal offense or misdemeanor criminal offense. You want to talk about bureaucracy?
Time's expired.
You want to talk about a police state? That's on you. I yield back. The distinguished gentlelady from Colorado posed a question that I've been hearing my Republican colleagues utter over the last several days. Who decides what is true or false? How can we know what is true or false? And the gentlelady confided her fear that the federal government would end up defining what's true or false. Well, my. That's an absolute assault on the Constitution of the United States, because we have an entire federal judiciary which is based on people getting up in court and swearing an oath under God or the Constitution to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the whole point of what federal courts do is to determine what's true and what's false. The whole judicial system is based on the difference between truth and lies. In fact, the administrative system, you want to get Social Security, either you're 65 or you're not. That's a matter of positive fact. You qualify for Medicare or you don't. Truth or fact. Yes, our system operates on the basis of truth or fact. Don't throw up your hands and say, oh, well, we can't know what the truth is. We can't know what lies are. We don't want bureaucrats telling us what that is. That's what democratic government is. That's how we operate, by our commitment to the truth. And that's why we all swear an oath here to uphold the Constitution. That's why people go to court and they swear an oath to tell the truth. Now, they take their shocking nihilism about what's true and what's false, and they convert it to this entire Congress. And it all starts, of course, with January 6th. And before that, the presidential election. All starts with a big lie. Donald Trump's big lie. Well, they say, well, who knows? Maybe he won, maybe he didn't. You say Joe Biden's president, we say Donald Trump's president. Nonsense. 60 federal state courts rejected every claim of electoral fraud and corruption that they put forward. 60. Federal and state courts rejected every claim. They don't have a single court that ever ruled in their favor. Donald Trump lost that election by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. So then their big lie now has to stretch all the way over January 6th. We have to disbelieve the evidence of our own eyes, of our own ears. We saw them come and descend upon this chamber, this Congress, wounding and injuring 150 of our police officers, breaking people's noses, breaking people's fingers, putting people in the hospital. And already they're back on the news with big lies saying, no, 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 it was a tourist visit. Like these real tourists up here who have to come and watch representatives in the United States Congress say there's no difference between truth and lies. Real tourists who are not beating the daylights out of our police officers. Now, so the lie now extends to January 6th. Who knows what really happened? Yeah, we all saw it. We saw the Vice President of the United States getting chased out of the chamber with people yelling, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." We had a bipartisan committee for a year and a half with more than 1,000 witnesses, 100 subpoena witnesses under oath, most of them from the Trump White House and the Trump family, and Republicans testify about Trump's plan to overturn the presidential election and get Pence just to install him in office, and yet they're agnostic about, well, the truth and lies. Who knows what really happened? Who knows? Yeah, who knows? Well, they've got a perfect bill for you then. We call it the Putin Protection Act. That's what it is, the Putin Protection Act. Distinguished gentleman from New York explained Putin spent millions of dollars in 2016 to pump propaganda, electoral sabotage into our political system. He did. Every security agency in the country told us that. We got a bipartisan report from the Senate saying it. They're agnostic about it. When it comes to Putin, they see no evil, they hear no evil, none of it. No, but we know that it happened, okay? That's Putin's plan. Why? Putin cannot beat America politically. He can't beat us economically. He can't beat us militarily. Putin can't beat us philosophically. There's one thing he's got, the internet. Why? Because we're a wide open country. And so he says, let's take advantage of it. Let's go on their social media platform. We'll put people who oppose Putin on the internet in jail, which they do. If you send a tweet against Putin, you're going to jail. You put out a tweet against his filthy imperialist war, which some of them support in Ukraine. If you put out a tweet against that in Russia, you're going to jail. But he says, let's take advantage of America's openness. We'll take advantage of them, and we're going to put out propaganda. We'll lie about when the election is. We'll say it's on Thursday when it's on Tuesday. We'll tell people to go vote next week, whatever. And that's the genesis of this whole thing. We have our security agencies who alert social media, and they say they're putting up fraudulent information on your platform. And now they come forward and they say the Democrats are trying to, what? Tell the truth. Not Democrats, the government, our paid federal government agencies are trying to tell the social media when foreign malign actors like Russia and China and Iran are trying to interfere in our elections. That's what this is about. Putin Protection Act. They want Putin and Xi to run free over our platforms, and then they want to fine federal government employees thousands of dollars if they alert our government to what foreign malign actors are doing. And the whole justification for it is their silly obsession with Hunter Biden's laptop and this New York Post story, which was taken down by Twitter for one day, 3 weeks before the election, as an exercise of their private decision-making. Then Elon Musk buys Twitter, and he fires 6 journalists because they disagree with him, they've got no problem with that because, of course, it's a private entity. They can do whatever they want. If they want to fire journalists, they fire them. If they want to take a story down for an hour or a day, they can do that. And then they want to turn that into the basis for handcuffing the entire government of the United States so we can't protect ourselves against Vladimir Putin and President Xi. Give me a break. I yield back. We oppose H.R. 5 because we stand with the school boards and the PTAs and the parents and the teachers, the students, and 13,000 school superintendents whose letter opposing this legislation I now ask unanimous consent to submit for the record. We stand with local governments against this outrageous power grab by MAGA Republicans in Washington who are supporting book banning, suppression of historical facts about slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and racial violence, and favoring top-down micromanagement of our local schools across America. Is there really a problem for parents like us with finding out what's in our public school libraries? Well, before you pass a massive new federal law and a massive new unfunded mandate for our local governments, why don't you take the time to make a phone call? That's what I did. I called up the person who runs the school libraries for Montgomery County, Maryland, which has more than 1 million people there, and I learned from Andrea Christman, who oversees all the media centers for our county, that the entire catalog of 2.2 million books is online, freely available, and current as of today. And anybody can go online and find it right now. So if all the info is out there, as local governments want it to be, then what is this about? Well, it's about book banning, of course. 2 years ago, more than 1,600 books were banned in the United States of America. Here are 3 of the key books that the right-wingers have been going after. Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner, about the dangerous fanaticism, authoritarianism, and abuse of the Taliban, a right-wing religious fundamentalist movement all about censorship and repressing women's control over their own bodies and their own fertility. The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's extraordinary dystopian novel about a right-wing misogynist movement which uses high technology and depraved religious ideology to control not only the minds of their followers, but the private and public lives and the fertility of women. And of course, George Orwell's 1984, because they have no sense of irony. They're always trying to censor this one. Mr. Chairman,
the gentleman's time's expired.
We need more politicians reading books in America and fewer politicians trying to censor books in America.
Mr. Chairman, today's been a great lost opportunity. In the wake of the brutal violence in Nashville, which took the lives of 3 children and 3 adults, we've had the opportunity to try to unify the country around concrete, practical action in order to reduce and end the bloodshed across America that we're suffering in these mass murders. And yet, we punted on it. We decided not to do anything on it. And that's sad, because it's not red states versus blue states. Some of my colleagues pointed out that the homicide rate is higher in red states. I take no joy in that. These are all Americans. These are all our people who are dying in the epidemic of gun violence sweeping across the country. And there should be no red states or blue states, just the United States when it comes to trying to preserve the public safety of our people. And it's the same thing with democracy. Our commitment to democracy and voting rights and representation should not be determined by who we think people are going to vote for. I'm an American, and I want every American to be represented in the Congress of the United States. I want every community of tax-paying, draftable citizens like the one in Washington, D.C. to have representation. And I consider that a matter of basic civic respect and democratic pride. Now, this has been a degraded, tawdry discourse today with obsessive questioning about public urination. I hope the public doesn't see this hearing and regard all of it as an episode of public urination in which the people of Washington are the ones getting rained on. What are we really here to discuss? Well, it's not defunding the police, which has nothing to do with it. And of course, Mr. Allen pointed out they were talking about 0.5% of the overall budget, a cut, but that has nothing to do with it. This is not budgetary in any way. We're not here to talk about carjacking as much as we've heard about carjacking, and we're not here to talk about anecdotes. The anecdotes are indeed grim, lurid, shocking. Here, I'll give you a few more. Man arrested after pistol whipping, carjacking. Man in custody after carjacking woman at gunpoint. Police arrest 2 juveniles on suspicion of carjacking after pursuit. 18-year-old arrested in carjacking mother at gunpoint in front of a child. Searching for a person of interest in a double homicide. And police department lookout tweets. Conducting a shooting investigation. Please avoid the area. I've been placed on lockdown due to a shooting in the area. Terrible. All of it. We should disenfranchise the people in this community, right? The people of Bakersfield, California, where I just took all these headlines from just by going online, which is represented by Speaker Kevin McCarthy. What an absurd way to think about legislating, to read a bunch of headlines and then think that that's some kind of principled analysis of a problem. Some of my colleagues said they were surprised to see Democrats standing up so strong for democratic self-government. I'm surprised to see so many Republicans standing up so strong for whatever a union says, because this is purely a police union agenda to say that they should be able to bargain their own discipline. And as Chairman Mendelson said, you've got people who are assailants, robbers, rapists, who are able to get back on the force because they've made that a matter of collective bargaining. Now, you might agree with it, you might disagree with it. This is the choice of the people of Washington, D.C. And this is going to come to the floor now, and they're going to engage in all of this hysterical anti-crime rhetoric. They're so tough on crime. Well, except for January 6th and violent insurrection and those 1,000 cases that are clogging up the courts of the District of Columbia. But they're so upset about crime, they want to overturn this police reform legislation. Ridiculous. Everybody should vote against this. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for launching this important discussion and for holding a hearing on responsible investment strategies that take into account all material considerations and risks when planning for Americans' retirement and savings. And you know, that's precisely what insurance companies, asset managers, builders, energy suppliers, transportation companies, farm businesses, auto manufacturers, landscapers, investment firms, and countless others are doing right now by incorporating into their business plans all relevant factors, including the calamitous consequences of climate change, the devastating hurricanes, the dangerous droughts, the sea level rise and coastal erosion, the stormwater flooding, the spread of disease, and other costly natural disasters produced by destabilization of the Earth's climate. But the same big oil and big gas companies that suppressed for decades their scientific understanding of the dynamics of climate change now want to deploy governmental power to literally block the ability of other private companies and asset managers to fulfill their fiduciary duties by planning around all relevant risks and costs, including the risks of climate change, which has already cost businesses, government, pensioners, and consumers billions and billions of dollars. Amazingly, the fossil fuel industry wants Big Brother now to march in and stop the free market from responding to the climate crisis that the carbon kings created. It's clear that honest American businesses are not buying the propaganda of climate denialism. They have a duty of loyalty and care to their shareholders, and they're focused on the actual bottom line, and that always means, as we will hear from the minority witness today, facing reality, facing the real risks and costs that businesses encounter, not swallowing a bunch of mythology and lies. America's most successful investors and asset managers have voluntarily and freely embraced responsible investment principles as a fulfillment of their legal fiduciary duty to minimize risk, maximize returns, and prudently plan for long-term challenges like the ones associated with climate change. That is the freedom, and that's the decision that the fossil fuel industry and its supporters want to destroy. But responsible investing works, and we have the opportunity to explain it today. The proof is in the pudding. Over the last decade, Bloomberg's ESG index performed dramatically better than Standard & Poor's traditional fossil fuel-based index. Consider this remarkable contrast on the sign behind me. Now, the ESG index is obviously performing a lot better than the general stock index, but I would never say, Mr. Chairman, because of these stunning trend lines, which smart investors will certainly take note of, I would never say that the states or the federal government should force all investors or asset managers to steer all their investments into ESG stocks like wind or solar or conservation or whatever. I would never say that. If there are investors who want to continue to invest in just big gas and big coal and big oil, that is totally their prerogative and right to do so, and I would never interfere with that. But one can only regard with amazement the fact that the fossil fuel industry is using their massive wealth and power now to try to force investment funds, asset managers, unions, pension funds, and businesses to invest in the less successful carbon-dominated stocks. It makes sense to say in the free market that no one should be forced to do the demonstrably right thing with their money, but it is appalling to say that everyone should be forced to do the demonstrably wrong thing with their money. Let's let the free market operate. The new campaign against what Tocqueville called the enlightened self-interest of American business comes dressed as an attack on woke capitalism, the same epithet used by Governor DeSantis in his attack on the Disney Corporation, which has backfired so badly on him. Responsible investing principles, including ESGs, have been freely chosen by America's companies and employed by asset managers and pension fund managers for decades. Right-wing attacks on these principles, fueled by dark money, corporate special interests, and flawed legal arguments, threaten now the savings and retirement of Americans by forcing asset managers to ignore material risks and considerations and violate their fiduciary duties. And we're hearing this from all over America. At the end of the day, the only way for asset managers to meet their fiduciary duties is to allow them the freedom to invest, focusing on what will provide the greatest return for their beneficiaries that they have a fiduciary duty to. Even if you favor as a personal financial strategy exclusive investment in oil and coal, you should not be interfering with the rights of others to make other decisions, especially when their decisions have been yielding significantly higher returns. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I want to thank the chairman kindly for his courtesy in granting me 2 minutes. Today's June 13th. We've had 164 days in the year 2023, and we've had 291 mass shootings. We're having, on average, a mass shooting and a half every single day in America. Of course, our colleagues would prefer not to talk about it because they say it's impolite to talk about a mass shooting on the day it happens. And on that theory, we would never talk about it, and we would continue ad infinitum into the carnage and the bloodshed that this unlimited open arms policy is giving America today. A number of my colleagues have invoked the Second Amendment. They only quote half of it. They say the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What about the first half of it? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. If a foreign government were doing it, we would declare war on them, but since we're just allowing the gun industry to spread these weapons of mass destruction around the country, they want to allow it. And they say that the Second Amendment must be respected in this strange and distorted way because they believe the Second Amendment gives the people the right to overthrow the government. This insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment means that the people must have an arsenal equal to that of the government. Well, it's very hard to explain the rest of the Constitution then. The Second Amendment doesn't mention anything about rebellion or insurrection. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Could I seek 1 more minute from the chair?
Give the gentleman 1 more minute.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 more minute.
Well, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 says, Congress has the power to call forth the militias from the states in order to, quote, suppress insurrections. Does that sound like a pro-insurrection document to you? How about the Republican Guarantee Clause? Congress shall guarantee to the people of the states a Republican form of government and assist them in putting down domestic violence. How about the Treason Clause, which says that treason shall consist of levying arms against the Union? I could give you 6 more examples like that, but why don't we pause on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says that anybody who has sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States and violates that oath by engaging in, quote, insurrection or rebellion shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. So that's not the meaning of our Constitution. The regulation the administration has adopted is perfectly constitutional, so if you want more bloodshed, just stand for that. It's got nothing to do with the Second Amendment. It's perfectly constitutional for us to engage in reasonable gun safety regulation. Check out Heller versus the District of Columbia. Justice Scalia wrote that opinion. Today we meet not to lower the costs of prescription drugs, nor to expand President Biden's infrastructure plan, nor to protect the voting rights of the people, nor to protect the health care choices of women across America, because we know they're definitely not interested in that. No, we meet rather for another stop on the GOP's endless revenge tour against Democrats who dared to tell the truth about Donald Trump and his repeated sellouts and betrayals of the American people over the last 6 years. It's all about Donald Trump tightening his stranglehold over Republicans for the 2024 campaign and driving out anyone who dares to think for himself or herself. But don't take my word for it. Just read Friday's statement by the twice impeached inciter of insurrection, sexual abuser, defamer of women, and indicted pilferer of national security secrets, war plans, and top secret classified documents himself. On Friday, Trump posted this order to his followers and this unveiled threat to anyone who would dare to defy his control over the GOP. Quote, any Republican voting against Adam Schiff's censure or worse should immediately be primaried, he wrote. The Luna resolution is a weapon of mass distraction from Trump's indictment by a Florida grand jury on 37 federal charges relating to obstruction and unlawful retention of defense information for storing dozens of classified, secret, and top secret documents at his Florida resort, in his bathroom, his bedroom, and beyond, and then refusing repeatedly for more than a year to return any of these official documents to the archives and the FBI. It's amazing to me that they have to change the subject from one of Donald Trump's current offenses against America to one of his older offenses, welcoming Russian interference in the 2016 presidential campaign. Russia repeatedly intervened in the 2016 campaign to help Donald Trump, and that's not a matter of opinion, that's a question of direct positive fact. Special counsel Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, whose report is cited authoritatively by Ms. Luna, found right at the beginning of his report that, quote, the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. Here's what the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence found in 2017. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. The Mueller investigation and the Moscow Project documented more than 250 episodes of collaboration and meetings between Russia and the Trump campaign, including Paul Manafort's repeated passing of campaign secrets, such as polling data to Konstantin Kilimnik, a Russian agent, and the infamous meeting on June 9, 2016 at Trump Tower, led by Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Russian lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya. Senator Marco Rubio, the Florida Republican, stated that the U.S. Senate Bipartisan Select Committee on Intelligence, quote, found irrefutable evidence of Russian meddling in the American campaign. So, the Mueller report, if you read it, makes no pronouncement on collusion, the putative crux of the distinguished gentlelady's complaint, because as Mueller writes, collusion is not a legal offense or a legal concept, and so the whole question of Trump's collusion with Russia is in the realm of opinion. And most Americans would see a lot of collusive activity all the way up to the present day when Donald Trump refuses even to take the side of the Ukrainian people against Vladimir Putin's filthy, bloody imperialist invasion of their country. which has been filled with lies, atrocities, and war crimes. In any event, we don't censure members over a difference of opinion. Today's madcap antics are an obvious deflection from Trump's deepening legal troubles, his allegedly criminal conduct in pilfering, hoarding, and refusing to return national security documents has caused his own Attorney General, William Barr, to say that, quote, Trump's conduct is indefensible. He's not a victim here. He was totally wrong, and there is no excuse for what he did here. Yesterday, Representative Boebert offered a resolution of impeachment against President Biden. The GOP simply has no ideas for our economy, no ideas for our country, and no idea for our people, but is on an embarrassing revenge tour on behalf of Donald Trump, who treats them like a ventriloquist dummy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to the witnesses. I thought we might be here today on the matter that the chairman declared as top priority, the crusade to find evidence of wrongdoing by President Biden. But now the majority's long-promised star witness turns out to be a fugitive from American justice, an arms trafficker indicted on 8 federal criminal felony counts and an unregistered foreign agent for China who tried to trade Chinese arms for Iranian oil. So I guess he's not going to be a witness for the majority anytime soon. Well, after the failed SARS reports, bank records, Form 1023, we can conclude that this Inspector Clouseau-style quest for something that doesn't exist has turned our committee into a theater of the absurd, an exercise in futility and embarrassment. And now we can finally definitively say why the committee's efforts have run dry time and again. Just yesterday, Mr. Chairman, you and I got a letter from Lev Parnas, the Ukrainian-born American businessman who was at Rudy Giuliani's side as his right-hand man for a year between November 2018 to October 2019, as Giuliani and then President Trump tried to smear Joe Biden before the 2020 election with the very same allegations we're still running through the political spin cycle every week in this committee. I request unanimous consent to enter the Parnas letter into the record. Now, in this extraordinary 10-page letter, Parnas painstakingly describes the campaign orchestrated by Giuliani and Trump to, quote, dig up dirt on the Bidens and spread misinformation about them through various networks, including government officials, journalists, and Fox News personnel. After explaining this campaign to fabricate corruption charges against Biden, Parnas concludes his letter by saying, throughout all these months of work, the extensive campaigns and networking done by Trump allies and Giuliani associates, including the enormously thorough interviews and assignments that I undertook, quote, there has never been any evidence that Hunter or Joe Biden committed any crimes related to Ukrainian politics. Never during any of my communications with Ukrainian officials or connections to Burisma did any of them confirm or provide concrete facts linking the Bidens to illegal activities. As Mr. Parnas concludes, there's never been any factual evidence, only conspiracy theories spread by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and then he calls on this committee to end its wild goose chase and offers to come and testify. Remember, this is Mr. Giuliani's guy. This is his interpreter and right-hand man who spent a year out there trying to cook the books against Joe Biden, and he offers to come testify. So if anyone doubts anything he's saying, let's bring him in as a witness, and let's hear about that crusade that they were on to smear President Biden by promoting the same baseless conspiracy theories that this committee serves up as moldy leftovers every day. At today's hearing, we're going to hear about wrongdoing by Hunter Biden, who's pleading guilty on 2 tax charges and a gun charge next week. We'll hear about the back and forth among investigators, prosecutors, and a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, over a dozen people who spent 4 years investigating the president's son. We'll hear about how they disagreed on investigative steps and what criminal charges to bring, all normal stuff in government investigations that doesn't usually lead to a congressional hearing. But one thing you will not hear today is any evidence of wrongdoing by President Joe Biden or his administration. Like every other try by our colleagues to concoct a scandal about President Biden, this one is a complete and total bust. In fact, the ongoing case that the majority invites us to interfere with today is actually a striking illustration of the success of the American system of independent prosecutors operating under the rule of law and outside the realm of the kind of political influence my colleagues are trying to exercise today. So what happened? Well, the son of the sitting president of the United States lost his brother and then lost his way badly back in 2015. As too many families around the country know, drug addiction is a dark and powerful affliction. And like other addicts, Hunter Biden made foolish and criminal choices, including failing to pay his taxes and owning a firearm in violation of federal law. And he's now being held criminally accountable for it. His investigation began under the Trump administration. It was conducted by a U.S. attorney for Delaware, David Weiss, who Donald Trump appointed to his office and who Attorney General Barr chose for this assignment to conduct this investigation. In his final press conference in December of 2020, Attorney General Barr expressed full confidence in Weiss's work, saying it was, quote, being handled responsibly and professionally within the department, and to this point I have seen no reason to appoint a special counsel, and I have no plan to do so before I leave. Furthermore, Joe Biden never publicly questioned or challenged this prosecution. When it began, he did not decry it as a witch hunt by Donald Trump. He placed his trust in the fairness of the American justice system. When he became president, not only did he not use his power to halt the investigation, he kept in place Trump's handpicked U.S. attorney, Mr. Weiss, overseeing it, even though incoming presidents usually replace U.S. attorneys with their own appointees. And his attorney general, Merrick Garland, made sure that Mr. Weiss, appointed by Donald Trump, had full authority and resources to pursue this probe and charge it however and whenever he saw fit in any district in the country. And in the past few weeks, as Hunter Biden accepted a guilty plea, the president and his attorney general have done nothing to interfere with the case, which is overseen by a federal judge appointed by, yes, Donald Trump. Now, can you imagine Donald Trump saying nothing about a witch hunt or not trying to quash the prosecution if it were his son being prosecuted? Indeed, President Biden's traditional and scrupulous respect for the independence of the Justice Department stands in sharp contrast to Trump's spectacular disrespect for the rule of law and his serial efforts, both in office and outside office, to get prosecutors to go after and lock up his political rivals and to suspend accountability in specific criminal cases when it comes to his friends. When Michael Flynn was investigated for lying to the FBI and later convicted for it about communicating with the Russians, or when Paul Manafort was investigated and later convicted for bank and tax fraud, or when Roger Stone was investigated and later convicted for lying to Congress and witness tampering, an outraged President Trump repeatedly denounced the Department of Justice for prosecuting his cronies and reportedly got Attorney General William Barr to pressure prosecutors to recommend more leniency in their cases. Trump also went to FBI Director James Comey and pushed him to pledge absolute loyalty to Trump and to find a way to let Flynn go. Ultimately, Trump used the power of the presidency to pardon all of these convicted criminals. Now, unlike President Trump's blatant abuse of the rule of law and the relationship between the president and DOJ, there's no evidence that President Biden has involved himself in any way in the investigation into his own son, an investigation that's been overseen by Trump's appointed U.S. attorney. No matter what my GOP colleagues say, and I appreciate the testimony of our witnesses today, there is no evidence that Hunter Biden has received any kind of official favoritism in this prosecution for being Joe Biden's son. On the contrary, there are more than 10 million Americans who have filed taxes but failed to pay them, the exact crime Hunter Biden is pleading guilty to. The vast majority of these cases are resolved administratively or through civil settlement. Indeed, every year the IRS and DOJ obtain convictions and sentences in fewer than 700 cases for tax crimes of any kind, a minuscule percentage. The fact that Hunter Biden faced a 4-year criminal probe involving dozens of agents and prosecutors from the IRS, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware, DOJ tax, demonstrates, to my mind at the very least, that he received no special treatment, but arguably selectively tougher treatment than the millions of the people who never face criminal investigation for doing the same thing. We are about to hear testimony from 2 IRS criminal investigators. They will describe their frustrations and disagreements with their supervisors, as well as with Mr. Weiss and his team of prosecutors, who they consider junior varsity and not up to snuff during the Trump administration generally. We will also hear about their confusion and profound misunderstandings about Mr. Weiss and how he reviewed the evidence and made the ultimate decision about charging Hunter Biden. A lot of the controversy here relates to the agent's failure to distinguish between special counsels and special lawyers, but we will clear that up today. The key point, Mr. Chairman, that America needs to understand is that the only political interference at play here is coming from Donald Trump and my Republican colleagues. We'll listen carefully to the testimony, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The left offers endless benefits. In other words, dependency, because dependent population votes for the providers of those benefits. But a human being needs a purpose, a good job, the ability to provide for a family, a belief in a creator in order to be happy. He or she doesn't need lockdowns and destroy their small businesses. He or she doesn't need free needles and syringes so they can inject themselves with deadly drugs. He or she doesn't need lower wages and more crime to thank illegal and alien invasion. That only raises anxiety.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm surprised to hear my colleague from Arizona say some of the things he's saying. First of all, the purpose of our government is laid out very clearly in the preamble of the Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and preserve to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty, ordain the Constitution. So surely it can make a difference in terms of people's individual lives and individual paths to recovery. People will derive sources of strength from many different places, including religious faith, including their friends and their family, including psychology and so on. But the idea that our drug strategy is flawed because it doesn't put religion at the center seems to me to be preposterous. And the gentleman also said no matter how you try to intercept it, it's going to make it worse. On the contrary, what I've heard from Dr. Gupta is that the new technologies of interception are working in order to reduce the flow of fentanyl into the country. Dr. Gupta, you say in the National Drug Control Strategy, saving lives is our North Star. What are you doing to save lives and prevent overdoses, and how does this differ from what was happening before?
Thank you, Congressman, Ranking Member, for that question. It is really important we meet people where they are today because of the crisis. One of those things is to make sure that we have naloxone or Narcan available to people when they're overdosing. As a doctor, I've seen people come into the emergency room 5 times sometimes in the same day. I've not judged them, but I do feel that saving that life was important to me. Make sure that they have a chance at getting into treatment. We're expanding treatment with telehealth, with expanding the ability. Congress was instrumental in making sure removing the X waiver that now goes from 129,000 doctors to almost 2 million doctors in this country. And then we're making sure that we're putting technology. I was down in Arizona, saw a 445% increase in detection. 38 million pills is what Customs Border Protection told me down there at the border.
So you're saying that the technology is working?
It is absolutely working.
That your strategies of interception are not failing, and we shouldn't surrender to the fatalism which says there's nothing that can be done about it other than everybody go home and pray about it. How are you addressing mental illness as an underlying cause of substance abuse?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mental illness and drug addiction go hand in glove, and they overlap with each other. And it is really important that we address both the mental health, social isolation, as well as addiction as piece of that. Just yesterday, the President announced the importance of parity, or day before yesterday, the importance of parity enforcement to make sure that people with physical health and mental health get the same level of care and not discriminated against. That's one of the reasons for not getting Americans the help they need, and the President is completely focused on that.
I read a fascinating article that I want to submit to the record, Mr. Chairman, called How to Stop the Mexican Cartels, Stop Supplying Them with Guns. And it makes the point that 75 to 90% of Mexican drug cartel firearms come from U.S. manufacturers and U.S. gun stores. As I understand it, there's only one gun store in all of Mexico. There's a much stricter control on firearms there. And the firearms that are being used by the cartels that are pumping fentanyl into our country are armed by American gun manufacturers. Would we actually be striking a blow for our efforts to reduce the flow of fentanyl into our country if we reduce the flow of firearms into Mexico coming from our gun dealers.
Ranking Member, it's critical to have a strong, stable partner on the south of the border. Part of that's to address the illegal weapons that are going on, smuggled down into Mexico, causing violence as part of the drug and other trades.
No foreign enemy has ever been able to shut down the government of the United States, but now MAGA Republicans are about to do just that. But they don't want to cut off public services to the people and deny paychecks to more than 1 million service members without first launching an impeachment drive, even when they don't have a shred of evidence against President Biden for an impeachable offense. And you think I'm being harsh? Here's what some Republicans have had to say over the last week about the actions of the Republicans as they watch up close, quote, the dysfunction caucus at work, in the words of our GOP colleague from Nebraska, Don Bacon. Clown show, foolishness, terribly misguided, stupidity, failure to lead, lunatics, disgraceful, new low, pathetic, enabling Chairman Xi, people that have serious issues. Those folks don't have a plan, show just how broken they are, and individuals that just want to burn the whole place down. Now, if I said any of these things, they'd probably take my words down, but these are Republicans talking about Republicans. Trump's convinced that if we shut the government down, his 4 criminal prosecutions on 91 different felony and misdemeanor charges will be defunded and delayed long enough to keep him from having to go before a jury of his peers before the 2024 election. And like flying monkeys on a mission for the Wicked Witch of the West, Trump's followers in the House now carry his messages out to the world, shut down the government, shut down the prosecutions. But the cult master has another command for his followers, which brings us here today. On August 27th, he posted this edict: either impeach the bum or fade into oblivion. They did it to us. Of course, the standard for impeachment is not whether they did it to us, but whether the president committed treason or bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors. But the Constitution's irrelevant to them. What counts is what Donald Trump wants. As Republican Representative Ken Buck, a Freedom Caucus member, told CNN the other day, President Trump has gone on his social media account and said we should be impeaching President Biden. Kevin McCarthy said we have an impeachment inquiry. You draw the conclusion, directly or indirectly, this impeachment inquiry was a result of President Trump's pressure. So we move from a Trump-ordered government shutdown to a Trump-ordered impeachment process, and yet back in the reality-based world, the majority sits completely empty-handed with no evidence of any presidential wrongdoing, no smoking gun, no smoke. In fact, we have had to slide awkwardly into a House impeachment process without the benefit of the floor vote that Speaker McCarthy insisted was absolutely imperative and necessary when Donald Trump was impeached. In fact, they went to the Department of Justice and they got an OLC opinion saying, quote, no committee may undertake the momentous move from legislative oversight to impeachment without the delegation by the full House of such authority. OLC opinion, January 19th, 2020. And that's why the House voted in the case of Donald Trump, but that's exactly what has not happened here because they don't have the votes, because dozens of Republicans recognize what a futile and absurd process this is. Now, the title of the hearing is The Basis for an Impeachment Inquiry of President Joseph Biden. And yet, they present us no basis at all today, even after 8 months of investigation. They've invited 3 witnesses to testify. Not one of them is an eyewitness to a presidential crime of any kind. Not one of them is a direct fact witness about any of the events related to Ukraine and Burisma. Not one of them has participated in the 8 months of investigation in which our distinguished chairman has publicly boasted that he received 100% of everything he asked for. And I quote, every subpoena that I've signed as chairman of the House Oversight Committee over the last 5 months, we've gotten 100% of what we've requested, whether it's with the FBI, with the banks, or with Treasury. That means we are the real witnesses here. In fact, the committee has received 12,000 pages of bank records. Here they are, right in front of us, printed double-sided. And not a single page shows a dime going to President Joe Biden. We've received 2,000 pages of SARS reports the chairman subpoenaed. We've held hearings and conducted interviews with everybody from Hunter Biden's business partners to a federal agent assigned to that investigation, and still we found no evidence of wrongdoing by President Biden. If the Republicans had a smoking gun or even a dripping water pistol, they would be presenting it today, but they've got nothing on Joe Biden. All they can do is return to the thoroughly demolished lie that Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump launched 5 years ago, the Burisma conspiracy theory, a fairy tale so preposterous that one of its main authors, Lev Parnas, has now disowned and repudiated it. This is the theory that Vice President Biden, global anti-corruption groups, and most Western governments targeted Ukraine Prosecutor General Shokin for removal because he was threatening the Burisma Corporation, whose board Hunter Biden served on. Trump synthesized the lie in his August 27th post about President Biden, saying, look, the guy got bribed. He paid people off, and he wouldn't give $1 billion to Ukraine unless they, quote, got rid of the prosecutor. Trump's story is the opposite of the truth. When Biden was VP, he worked as a key player in the Obama administration and global community's efforts to combat corruption in Ukraine. In late 2015, as part of a coordinated global effort, Biden called for the removal of Viktor Shokin, a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor general who did nothing about corruption in Ukraine other than to participate in it, rather than assist British authorities who were actually investigating Burisma and its owner. Shokin consistently frustrated their efforts. The leadership provided by Biden was part of a broad bipartisan campaign to oppose corruption in Ukraine. In early 2016, Republican senators Ron Johnson, Rob Portman, and Mark Kirk wrote to the Ukrainian president assailing corruption in his country and urging him, quote, to press ahead with urgent reforms to the prosecutor general's office. Yet years later, in 2018, as President Trump saw Biden as a strong rival in the 2020 election, he worked with Giuliani to twist all the facts around and to suddenly accuse Biden of corruption in calling for the dismissal of a corrupt prosecutor. A few months ago, Chairman Comer and the committee received an insider's account of the plan to concoct and spread this lie from an extraordinary letter sent to us by Lev Parnas, who was Rudy Giuliani's right-hand man. Giuliani and Parnas searched high and low to find anyone who would endorse their contortions about Biden. Their failing crusade culminated in the infamous phone call that then President Trump made to Ukrainian President Zelensky, in which Trump threatened to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars in economic, strategic, and military security assistance to Ukraine unless Zelensky embraced their ridiculous fabrication and falsely advertised to the world that Ukraine was investigating Joe Biden. This shakedown became the basis for the first House impeachment of President Trump. Giuliani's big lie has been thoroughly debunked by multiple sources. As Congressman Buck, a former chief of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Colorado and a member of the House Freedom Caucus said, and I quote, there is in fact no evidence that Shokin was engaged in an investigation of Burisma or that Joe Biden's role in his firing was in any way connected to Burisma. He continued, what's missing despite years of investigation is the smoking gun that connects Joe Biden to his never-do-well son's corruption. It's scandalous to use impeachment to establish a counterfeit moral equivalence between President Biden, an honorable public servant who has never been indicted or convicted of anything in his career of more than 50 years in public life, and Donald Trump, a twice-impeached president who's recently been found in court to have sexually abused and defamed a woman and fraudulently inflated the value of his real estate properties while facing 91 criminal charges in 4 separate indictments on everything from conspiring to overthrow an election and defraud the American people to making criminal hush money payoffs to stealing classified government documents and hiding them while obstructing justice. Impeachment is the people's final weapon of constitutional self-defense against a president who behaves like a king and violates the public trust by committing treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors equivalent to them. It is reserved for extraordinary public offenses like inciting a violent insurrection against the American government and trying to overthrow our presidential election. That offense in 2021, whose related crimes have resulted in hundreds of criminal convictions and hundreds more being prosecuted, led to Donald Trump's second impeachment in the House on a massive bipartisan vote of 232 to 197 and a similarly lopsided bipartisan vote of 57 to 43 in the Senate. I wonder how many of my esteemed Republican colleagues here who all voted against impeaching Donald Trump, if they were in the House at that point, can reconcile their votes against impeaching Trump for the grave crime of inciting a violent insurrection against the government with their calls supporting impeachment of Joe Biden for allegedly committing a high crime and misdemeanor that has not even been defined yet, much less proven. Mr. Chairman, if this dysfunction caucus is going to insist on going forward, we must receive the testimony of Rudy Giuliani and Lev Parnas, the insiders who know the origins of the lie upon which this sham impeachment is based and who work to spread it. We know that Mr. Parnas is ready and willing to testify, and as a former U.S. Attorney and Mayor, Mr. Giuliani will surely agree to enlighten us on everything. Pursuant to Clause 2K6 of Rule 11, I move that the committee subpoena Rudy Giuliani and Lev Parnas to come and testify in these hearings. And I would like to ask for a vote on that or debate, as you would please, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Jordan.
I move to table the motion.
There's a motion to table Mr. Raskin's motion. Is there a second?
I'd like to ask for a recorded vote on that, Mr. Chairman. This is on the subpoena of the 2 key figures, Rudy Giuliani and Lev Parnas.
Key figures for what?
But in your theory about why President Biden should be impeached, I think
this
they're
is going to
peddling
be an
discredited
informative
lies.
hearing for you, Mr. Raskins, because we were going to present evidence.
What evidence? There's no evidence witnesses. There are no fact
just
witnesses.
sit back and let the American people see the hearing and let the American people decide.
All right.
Now look, you've gone over your time. We're going to have a we're going to go by the rules here.
Okay.
Okay.
Motion
and I'm glad you brought the box of bank statements. If we had a box of all the foreign money the Bidens took, it would have reached to the ceiling.
Yeah.
So let's just have
point
this
of parliamentary
hearing.
inquiry.
No, listen. Everybody's going to get 5 minutes. I'm going to present the witnesses. Everyone's going to get a chance. 5 minutes. I'll let the ranking member go way over time in his opening statement, but we are going to abide by the 5 minutes.
There's a motion to table on the floor.
There's a motion on the floor.
There's a motion on the floor.
Roll call.
There's a non-debatable motion on the floor.
Parliamentary inquiry. Mr. Chairman, there was a motion to close the vote, and it was properly seconded.
There is. Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 20, the nays are 19.
The motion passes to table the Raskins motion now.
Thank you, Chair McLean, for calling the hearing, and also Ms. Porter and Mr. Mfume for their thoughtful remarks today. Look, the American people want a tax system that is simpler, fairer, and more responsive. And I wish that we could have hearings on each of those. I mean, just to take a look at simplicity, for example, I've lived in foreign countries where they don't have a multi-billion-dollar business in H&R Block and all of these companies that are trying to help people understand their taxes. And most people's taxes, 90% of the people's taxes could be done in 15 minutes or 20 minutes, which is what it's like in countries around the world. We should be having a hearing about why we have a $10 billion a year plus business in helping people do what the government should be helping them do instead. But what we've got is one more hearing to beat up on the IRS as part of the program to deconstruct the administrative state
as Steve Bannon promised at the beginning of the Trump administration, and we're right in the throes of it. One can only regard with amazement that any member of the Republican Party today would lecture the commissioner of the IRS about efficiency or organization or anything else. Now, the implementation of the IRA shows that providing adequate resources to the IRS dramatically improves services to our people and the effectiveness of the overall mission. In the 2023 filing season, IRA investments allowed the IRS to create and adopt digital tools to process tax returns more efficiently. The agency greatly improved in-person service, service over the telephone, and online customer service. But we know a lot more needs to be done. I have a constituent who came in to see us in August. He and his wife had filed their taxes in April. They got their refund from the state of Maryland in 2 weeks. After 5 months and multiple attempts to get the IRS to send their tax refund, they still couldn't get it. They reached out to my office in desperation, and we were able to work with the taxpayer advocate to make it happen. But nobody should have to go through that experience of bureaucratic lethargy and frustration like that. But we know that you're making improvements. It's moving in the right direction, but you're writing against a background of decades of deliberate underinvestment. Well, the IRA is also making an administration of the tax system more equitable. You're hiring experts who can audit and enforce tax laws against big corporations and ultra-wealthy filers who've been able to get away with a lot before that. Commissioner Werfel, how has the IRA allowed IRS to crack down on tax cheats? Is the investment the American people have made paying off in terms of the money we're getting back?
It is, Ranking Member Raskin, it absolutely is. And we are putting the money to work today to take a variety of different steps. We're increasing the number of audits on our largest corporations using analytics that we've invested in to make sure that we select the right corporations that are the highest risk of shielding income inappropriately. We've increased the number of audits on complex partnerships, something that GAO has pointed out, how anemic our partnership audit rate is. And again, we're using invested new tools and analytics to make sure that we're understanding the types of trends necessary to know where those complex partnerships are that are actually evading taxes, so we improve the efficiency of our audit. And as mentioned earlier, we've launched an effort to get back taxes from millionaires and billionaires. And we've identified 1,600 high priority targets, if you will, of millionaires and billionaires. And we've already collected in the early months over 100 million in back taxes. All of that is IRA money being put to work. And as you mentioned, on the services side, we have a lot of work to do. Building block by building block, we are making changes to our services to make that story that you told a thing of the past.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I have images of 3 politicians in my office: Abraham Lincoln, Robert F. Kennedy, and Samuel F. Bellman, who was the first Jewish person ever elected to the Minnesota legislature, a great champion of civil rights and civil liberties in the Constitution and of the creation of the State of Israel, the Jewish democratic state, in 1948. And he was my grandfather. He was elected at a time of terrible anti-Semitism. Not unlike today, Minneapolis was actually called the anti-Semitism capital of America. And my grandpa told me a story I'll never forget. The Democratic Farm Labor Party and Republican caucuses both had their annual retreats at a country club that did not allow Jews or blacks to enter. My grandfather complained privately to the speaker about the fact he wouldn't be able to go to his own retreat, and the speaker apologized but said that it was a tradition. So my grandfather, the only Jewish person in the chamber, spoke on the floor about anti-Semitism, and he was booed and jeered at, and members left as he tried to speak. When the minority leader asked me to manage our time today, I thought about my grandfather and how he must have felt on that day. So I rise here not in spite of the fact that I am a Jewish American who supports the Constitution and the Jewish democratic state and hates all the anti-Semitic tyrants and terrorists of the world, from Putin in Russia and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia to Hezbollah and Hamas. I am here because of these things and because of everything that I believe in and stand for. At this moment when democracy is under siege all over the world, America must stand tall for the Constitution of the United States, and this resolution is about one thing and one thing only: the punishment of speech. So we have the chance to show the world what the American Constitution means and how we hold fast to our core principles, even when we're drawn away from them by our passions and our righteous anger. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the very heart of it is our First Amendment, which protects every citizen's freedom of speech and says Congress shall make no law abridging it. The freedom to speak includes the freedom to disagree, the right to think radically differently from the majority about important things, or else it is no freedom at all. It's easy to defend freedom of speech for people when you agree with them. The test for each member today is whether you can defend freedom of speech for people when you most fundamentally and vehemently disagree with them. The First Amendment is like an apple, and everybody wants to take just one little bite out of it. Left-wing speech, right-wing speech, sexist speech, feminist speech, homophobic speech, pro-LGBTQ speech, anti-war speech, pro-war speech, religious speech, sacrilegious speech. Everybody just wants one bite out of the apple. But you know what? At the end of the day, once everybody's taken his or her bite, you know what's left? Nothing. There's nothing left. If you want to save the apple, you have to learn to tolerate not just the speech you love the most, but the speech you hate the most. Now, like the First Amendment, the Speech or Debate Clause embodies this central value in the proceedings of this body. It states that members of Congress shall in all cases, except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and from the same. And for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. In the 2.5-century history of this great chamber, members have been overwhelmingly censured for their actions, not for their speech. Actions like participating in the violent assault against Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, assaulting Representative Josiah Grinnell of Iowa with a cane,